There is something happening inside your body right now that most doctors don't screen for, most people never suspect, and almost no one talks about in the same breath as diet, sleep, or exercise. It doesn't show up on a standard blood panel. It doesn't come with obvious symptoms, but the research is now so compelling that some scientists have started calling it one of the greatest public health threats of the modern era. It isn't high blood pressure. It isn't poor diet. It isn't even chronic stress, though it's deeply connected to all three. It's the quality of your human connections and whether or not you feel genuinely seen, valued, and close to other people. Stay with me here, because what you're about to learn is going to completely change the way you think about your health. Not in a vague, feel-good way, in a specific, biological, measurable way that affects how long you live, how well your immune system works, how clearly you think, and how deeply you sleep. And the evidence behind it is stronger than most people could ever imagine. Let's start with a number that stopped researchers cold when they first saw it. In a landmark analysis that reviewed data from over 300,000 people across multiple countries, scientists found that individuals who reported weak or insufficient social relationships had a 50% greater likelihood of dying early compared to those with strong social connections. Not 5%, not 10%, 50%. That figure put inadequate social connection on par with smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, and ranked it as more dangerous to long-term health than physical inactivity, obesity, and air pollution. That study was published more than a decade ago. Since then, the science has only deepened and grown more specific. Researchers now understand not just that social disconnection is harmful, but why, and the mechanism is far more physical than most people ever imagined. Your body was not designed to be alone. That isn't a philosophical statement, it's a biological one. For most of human history, being separated from your social group meant almost certain death. Predators, starvation, exposure to the elements, survival in the ancient world was fundamentally a collective project. So over hundreds of thousands of years, the human nervous system evolved an exquisitely sensitive alarm system to detect and respond to social isolation. That alarm system is still running inside you right now, often without you even knowing it. When your brain perceives that you are isolated, truly isolated, not just temporarily alone, it triggers a cascade of physiological responses that are remarkably similar to what happens when your body detects a physical threat. Your stress hormones rise. Specifically, cortisol levels increase and remain elevated for longer than normal. Your immune system shifts into a particular inflammatory state, ramping up the production of proteins called cytokines that prime your body to fight infection and heal wounds quickly. This makes evolutionary sense. If you were separated from your group in the ancient world, injury and infection were likely coming, so your body prepared. But here's where the modern problem begins. In the ancient world, isolation was temporary. You were separated from your group for a few days. Your body mounted this survival response, and then connection was restored. Today, millions of people are living in a state of chronic low-grade social disconnection. Not dramatic, obvious isolation, but a persistent sense of not truly belonging, not being deeply known, not having people they can really count on. And when that threat signal stays switched on for months or years, the very survival response that was meant to protect you begins to cause damage. Chronic loneliness, and it's important to distinguish loneliness from simply being alone, is now linked to measurable changes in the cardiovascular system, the immune system, the brain, and even gene expression. The breadth of that list is what makes this science so genuinely remarkable. Let's take the heart first, because the data here is the most mature. Multiple large-scale studies have found that people with poor social connection have a significantly elevated risk of both heart disease and stroke. One study that tracked nearly 23,000 participants over several years found that lonely individuals had a 29% higher risk of heart disease and a 32% higher risk of stroke compared to those who reported feeling socially connected. These aren't marginal differences. These are risk levels that would have any cardiologist paying close attention. The mechanisms are now better understood than ever. Chronic social stress keeps cortisol and adrenaline elevated, which over time raises blood pressure, promotes arterial inflammation, and accelerates the buildup of plaque in blood vessel walls. Sleep quality also degrades. Lonely individuals tend to experience more fragmented sleep, spending less time in the restorative deep sleep stages where cardiovascular repair happens. The heart, in other words, doesn't just break metaphorically. Under the sustained biological pressure of chronic disconnection, it breaks physiologically. The immune system tells an equally striking story. Researchers studying the biology of loneliness have consistently found a particular pattern they call the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, CTRA for short. In people experiencing chronic loneliness, certain genes involved in inflammatory immune responses are turned up, while genes responsible for antiviral defenses are turned down. In practical terms, this means the body becomes primed for fighting bacteria and healing wounds, the ancient threat, at the expense of fighting viruses and potentially cancerous cells, which are the threats that actually matter in the modern world. This genetic shift doesn't require dramatic isolation to occur. Studies have found it in people who report feeling lonely even when surrounded by others, people who have relationships that feel superficial, who feel misunderstood or disconnected from those around them. It's the subjective experience of loneliness, not the objective fact of being alone, that drives these biological changes. That distinction is critical. You can be married, have colleagues, and maintain a busy social calendar, and still trigger this response if the connections you have don't feel genuine or meaningful. The brain is perhaps the organ most profoundly shaped by social experience, and the ways loneliness rewires neural function are some of the most fascinating and sobering findings in modern neuroscience. Social pain, it turns out, activates many of the same neural circuits as physical pain. This isn't metaphor, it's neuroimaging data. When participants in brain scanning studies experience social rejection or exclusion, the areas of the brain that light up include the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, regions that also respond to physical injury. The body doesn't cleanly distinguish between being cut and being rejected. Both register as injury that demands a response. Over time, chronic loneliness appears to alter the brain's threat detection circuitry in a self-reinforcing way. Lonely individuals show increased vigilance for social threats. Their brains are essentially scanning the environment more intensely for signs of rejection or danger. But this heightened vigilance comes at a cost. It makes social interactions feel more threatening, which leads to more withdrawal, which deepens isolation, which amplifies vigilance further. Neuroscientists describe this as a loneliness trap, a self-perpetuating feedback loop that, without intervention, tends to worsen over time rather than resolve naturally. This also helps explain why cognitive function begins to decline with chronic loneliness. The mental resources consumed by constant social threat scanning leave less cognitive bandwidth available for memory, focus, and learning. Studies have found that lonely older adults show accelerated cognitive decline and a significantly elevated risk of developing dementia, with some research suggesting a risk increase of more than 40%. The social brain, deprived of the stimulation and regulation it evolved to expect, begins to work against itself. There's something else the research reveals that most people find genuinely surprising: what loneliness does to your sleep. Loneliness and sleep disruption have a bi-directional relationship, meaning each one makes the other worse in a compounding cycle. Lonely individuals are significantly more likely to experience fragmented sleep. They wake more often during the night, spend less time in deep, slow-wave sleep, and report feeling less rested even after a full night in bed. This isn't just about subjective experience. Objective measurements using polysomnography, which records brain activity during sleep, confirm that the sleep of chronically lonely people is architecturally different, shallower and less restorative. And disrupted sleep then feeds back into the system, increasing inflammatory markers, impairing emotional regulation, increasing sensitivity to social threats, and making it harder to initiate and maintain the connections that would actually help. It is one of the clearest examples of how a social and emotional experience becomes thoroughly physical, embedded in the rhythms of the body itself. By now, you might be wondering where you personally fall on this spectrum, and that question is worth sitting with because loneliness is remarkably common, remarkably poorly understood, and remarkably good at hiding. Research consistently finds that a significant portion of adults, in many surveys, somewhere between a third and a half of those asked, report meaningful levels of loneliness, and this is not a phenomenon limited to older adults as the popular perception goes. Studies from the past decade have found that loneliness peaks among young adults in their late teens and 20s, and again in older age, with middle age offering a kind of buffer that many younger people haven't yet found. The college years and the years immediately after are, for many people, the loneliest of their lives, despite being surrounded by peers. This is because loneliness has nothing to do with how many people are around you and everything to do with whether those relationships feel substantive. The distinction researchers draw is between social isolation, literally having few contacts, and loneliness, which is the gap between the connections you have and the connections you feel you need. A person can be socially isolated without feeling lonely. A person can be socially surrounded and feel profoundly lonely. The biology doesn't care about head count. It cares about felt belonging. There is another dimension to this that the science is only beginning to map, the role of physical touch. Human beings are tactile creatures in a way that goes far deeper than comfort or affection. The skin is the largest sensory organ in the body, and it contains specialized nerve fibers, called C-tactile afferents, that respond specifically to gentle, affiliative touch. These fibers connect directly to the brain's reward and social bonding circuits, and when activated by safe, warm contact, they trigger the release of oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, which reduces cortisol, lowers blood pressure, slows heart rate, and promotes a sense of safety and calm. Research has found that people who receive more physical affection, not just romantic but platonic, handshakes, hugs, shoulder contact from friends, show lower inflammatory markers, stronger immune responses to vaccination, and greater resilience to stress. Premature infants in neonatal intensive care who receive regular skin-to-skin holding by their parents show dramatically better developmental outcomes than those who receive equivalent medical care without that contact. Touch is not a luxury. For the human nervous system, it appears to be a necessity. In cultures and contexts where physical touch has become more restricted, whether through geographic separation, changing social norms, or the shift toward digital communication, this is one more way the biological infrastructure of connection gets quietly undernourished. The digital question is one worth examining carefully because it's the area where the most heated debate currently lives in this field. Social media and digital communication tools have allowed people to maintain contact across distances that would once have severed relationships entirely. That's real, and it matters. But the evidence increasingly suggests that digital connection is not a simple substitute for in-person interaction, at least not for the body's regulatory systems. In-person social interaction appears to synchronize physiological processes between people in ways that digital communication doesn't replicate. Heart rates, breathing patterns, and even brainwave activity have been observed to come into closer alignment during face-to-face engagement. This physiological co-regulation may be part of how human nervous systems have always helped regulate each other, a form of biological mirroring that goes beyond what a screen can currently transmit. That doesn't mean digital relationships are worthless. Many people sustain genuine, meaningful, deeply nourishing connections through video calls, messaging, and online communities. The quality of the interaction, the sense of being understood, valued, and truly present with another person, matters far more than the medium. But when digital interaction replaces rather than supplements in-person contact, and when it's primarily passive, scrolling through curated highlights of others' lives rather than engaging in genuine exchange, the research suggests it tends to deepen rather than relieve feelings of disconnection. So what does any of this mean in practical terms? What does the science of connection actually tell us about how to protect our health? The first thing worth internalizing is that the quality of relationships matters far more than the quantity. Research consistently finds that having even one or two close, reliable, emotionally intimate relationships is associated with dramatically better health outcomes than having a large social network of superficial contacts. You don't need to be the most socially active person in every room. You need relationships in which you feel genuinely known and genuinely safe. Reciprocity turns out to be particularly important. Relationships that feel one-sided, where one person consistently gives more than they receive, don't appear to confer the same protective benefits as those that feel balanced. This may be because the sense of being valued and mattering to someone is a key component of the felt belonging that drives the biology. Charity and kindness are their own form of nourishment, but they don't fully replace the experience of being cared for in return. There's also strong evidence that the regularity and predictability of social contact matters, not just the intensity. A brief daily exchange with a neighbor, a regular weekly call with a close friend, a recurring lunch with a colleague. These low-intensity, high-frequency contacts appear to contribute meaningfully to social well-being, perhaps because they provide a consistent signal to the nervous system that connection is stable and available. Physical activity in social contexts deserves a particular mention because it combines two of the most evidence-supported buffers against loneliness and chronic stress. Group exercise, whether that's a team sport, a fitness class, a running club, or a casual walk with a friend, has been found in multiple studies to have mental health benefits that exceed those of equivalent exercise done alone. The social element amplifies the mood-regulating effects of physical activity, likely through a combination of endorphins, oxytocin, and the psychological impact of shared effort and achievement. This synergy is worth taking seriously. If you are someone who already exercises, asking whether you can sometimes do that with others might be one of the highest leverage health changes available to you. If you're someone trying to build more social connection, but feeling the barrier of having to make conversation, shared physical activity removes that pressure entirely. You can simply be alongside someone, moving toward the same goal, and let the connection grow without effort. One of the most counterintuitive findings in this field is that the act of contributing to others, volunteering, mentoring, helping a neighbor, is one of the most reliable and consistent predictors of loneliness reduction and improved well-being. This effect appears to work in part because it provides a sense of purpose and mattering that isn't dependent on being invited or chosen, and in part because it places you in regular contact with others around a shared goal, which tends to build connection more naturally than contexts designed specifically for socializing. People who feel lonely sometimes find purely social settings, parties, mixers, social events designed for meeting new people, paradoxically alienating because the explicit goal of connection creates performance pressure and threat vigilance. Contributing to a cause or a community, by contrast, shifts attention outward and creates natural conversation anchors that bypass the self-consciousness that often makes loneliness worse. The broader lesson that emerges from all of this is one that tends to get lost in a culture that relentlessly emphasizes individual health optimization, the supplements, the diets, the sleep tracking, the biohacks. Human health is not just a solo project, it is inherently relational. The body evolved inside a social context, and it continues to need that context to function optimally. This doesn't mean that diet, sleep, and movement don't matter. They matter enormously. But framing them as the entire project of health, while ignoring the social infrastructure of the body, is like optimizing the performance of a single instrument while ignoring the orchestra it's part of. The irony is that in a culture that has made individual wellness a serious focus, many people are more attentive than ever to what they eat and how they move, while being less connected than at any point in recent history. Loneliness has increased in surveys across multiple countries over the past several decades, coinciding almost precisely with the rise of digital communication, remote work, and increasingly individualized daily lives. There's a particular dimension of this worth sitting with as we near the end, and it's one that the science can only gesture toward, the experience of feeling truly seen. Beyond the frequency of contact, beyond the reciprocity of relationship, researchers who study connection at its deepest level often point to something harder to quantify: the sense that someone else genuinely understands who you are, what you feel, and what matters to you. Not a performance of understanding, but actual recognition. There's evidence that this specific quality of being known, not just liked or socially accepted, but genuinely understood, is a particularly potent protective factor. It appears to confer a sense of existential security that helps buffer the nervous system against threat, that stabilizes the sense of self under pressure, and that sustains well-being even in the absence of frequent contact. Some of the healthiest older adults in longitudinal studies are not those with the largest social networks, but those who feel deeply known by a small number of people who have stayed close across time. So, as you think about your own health, and you will, because that's what this kind of information tends to set in motion, it might be worth asking not just the standard questions about diet and exercise and sleep, but the more personal ones. Who in your life do you feel genuinely understood by? Do the connections you have feel like exchanges, or do they feel mostly one-directional? Are there relationships you've been meaning to invest in more, ones that have drifted to the periphery because modern life simply carried everyone along too fast? When did you last have a conversation with someone, really a conversation, uninterrupted, present, with no screen pulling attention away, that left you feeling less alone in the world? These aren't soft questions. Based on everything the research shows, they are among the most health-relevant questions a person can ask. And unlike many health interventions, the answers are not locked behind cost, access, or genetics. They depend on choices, ordinary, daily, human choices about where to invest your attention, your time, and your willingness to be known by others. The body keeps a kind of ledger that most of us never see. It tracks not just what we eat and how we move, but how safe we feel, how seen we feel, and how reliably others show up for us. That ledger influences inflammation, hormone levels, immune function, cardiovascular health, brain structure, and the expression of our genes. It is written not in food diaries or fitness logs, but in the quality of our moments with other people. The science of connection is still young, and there is much that researchers don't yet fully understand. But what is already known is too significant to treat as a peripheral concern. Social health is biological health. The way we relate to each other is woven into the way our bodies work. If that changes how you think about even one relationship, even one conversation, one phone call you've been putting off, one moment of genuine presence with someone who matters, then the most important thing this information can do, it has already done.